So yesterday we spent the whole day looking at Athanasius and the Nicene faith, looking at the movement toward the articulation in the Nicene Creed. We talked about a consensus in the church that was obscured by the fact that people were using the word hypostasis differently. And we also talked about the problems created by the past associations of the word homoousios. All of those were eventually resolved as the church decided we're going to use hypostasis to mean person, so three of them in God. And ousia will mean nature, essence, one in God, homoousios, in the sense that the Son is the same essence or same substance as the Father. So as all of that was worked out, that led to the final version of the Nicene Creed at the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 381. Now we're ready to turn our attention from the Nicene Creed to the Council of Chalcedon. And the Chalcedonian definition that was developed in the year 451 is above all else a commentary on the Nicene Creed. And so what I want to do as we get started looking at this morning is to talk about some things that were happening in the 4th century before we get to Cyril of Alexandria in the 5th century. So in the 4th century, as the church was recognizing its consensus regarding the Son and his full divinity, his equality with the Father, his eternality, there was also some controversial thinking that was happening about the incarnation of the Son. And so there are two people that I want to talk about briefly to set the stage for what we're going to do in just a few minutes. The first of those is Diodore of Tarsus, and the second of those is Apollinarius of Laodicea. So Tarsus is where Paul was from. In southeastern Anatolia, it is south-central Turkey today. And Diodore, in the middle of the 4th century, was a very strong supporter of the Nicene faith. So he firmly agreed with the full divinity of the Son with respect to the Father. But Diodore began to put forward a Christology in which Christ is not the Son. Christ is a man in whom the Son dwells. So it's a Christology of indwelling. The Logos indwells the man Jesus, enabling him to advance to God, and the Holy Spirit indwells each of us, enabling us to advance to God. So you notice that in that kind of Christology, Christ is not fundamentally different from us. He's basically our example. He's our leader in a process that we have to follow as well. Notice that this amounts to the same thing as Arianism. It is not Arianism because he affirms the full divinity of the Son. But in spirit, it amounts to the same thing because it turns salvation into an upward ascent. The man Jesus has to ascend upward. We have to ascend upward. He does so with the help of the indwelling Logos. We do so with the help of the indwelling Spirit. Now, why would anybody want to say that? If the Nicene Creed is saying the Son, for us men in our salvation, came down, why would anybody want to say that? Say what Diodore was saying. Well, basically what's happening, in my opinion, is that philosophically, it is very awkward to say that God died on the cross. That's a philosophical problem, an intellectual problem that the church has had to deal with for its entire history. And for people from a Greek philosophical mentality, that's an extremely awkward thing to affirm. And so one of the ways that the church deals with that, the way that Diodore deals with that, is simply to say, let the philosophical concern rise to the surface. If it's philosophically awkward or impossible to say that the Son died, don't say that. Ascribe the death to someone else. And that someone else is the man, Jesus. And so he develops what is called in Greek, a duoprosopic Christology, a two-person Christology, in which the Logos is up here and the man, Jesus, is down here. And the Logos indwells the man, helps him, provides cooperation, but all of the human experiences of Christ are ascribed to the man. And that's what Diodor was saying. Now notice the difference between this and what Athanasius was saying and what the church as a whole was saying. Athanasius is saying the Son of God lives in a divine way from eternity past to eternity future. He always has, he always will live in a divine way. But there's also a human way of living as well, in which you are born, you grow up, you have to eat, you have to sleep, etc., etc. You die. This is a human way of living. The same person, the Son of God, lives in a divine way, and after the incarnation, also in a human way. But he is the same person. He does that. Does that make sense? This is what the church has been saying. In fact, the way the church said this was as God, as man, or as Logos, as man. The Son calms the storm as God, but the Son is tired and hungry and needs to eat as man. The Son fills heaven and earth as God, but the same Son is confined to a single place as man. The Son is immortal as God, but the Son nevertheless dies on the cross as man. As God, as man. That's the way the church in the 3rd and the 4th century talked about the Son. So the most important point that they're trying to make is that this man, Jesus Christ, is the same person who has always been the Father's eternal Son. This sounds a little bit different from what we're used to because we are used to looking at Chalcedon and focusing on two natures and then beginning our discussion of Christ from those two natures. But that isn't what the church did. Chalcedon is a conclusion. It's not the starting point. And the starting point is to think of the Son in two ways, as God, as man. And so then they ask, in order to live as man, what does he need to take upon himself? A body, obviously, a human soul, a human mind, human emotions, everything pertaining to human life except sinfulness. He needs to take upon himself. And he does so in order to live as man. That's what Athanasius is saying. That's what's implied in the 2nd paragraph of the Nicene Creed. Does everybody see that? Okay? And do you see the difference between that and what Diodor is saying? Diodor is saying, here's the Logos, or the Son. Here's the man Jesus. They're different persons. The Logos didn't die on the cross. In one of the most scandalous passages in Diodor, he says that, excuse me, he says that when Jesus was hanging on the cross, the Logos actually abandoned him, left him, had nothing to do with that death. Okay? You see how different this is? If it's so different, then why do we not notice the difference? And the main reason for that is that Diodor, in talking about these two persons, used the word physis to describe them. One physis, the other physis. So Diodor was drawing the line where that pen is. Ousia means essence. Physis, hypostasis, and prosopon all mean person. And so we were speaking of one physis, the logos, one physis, the man. Okay? And they were separate, except that the logos indwelt the man. And the purpose of human life was to ascend to salvation. Now, later, the church is going to draw the line here, but not in Ethiopia. In Greece, at Chalcedon, the church is going to draw the line here. And almost all Western theologians and scholars are going to assume that whenever anybody uses the word physis, they are using it to mean nature. And so they're going to read Diodor as saying one nature of the man, one nature of the logos. What's the problem? Okay? If you just look for terminology, and if you assume the words are being used this way, with the line, you see what I mean when I draw the line, when I talk about drawing the line. So these are words for essence, and these are words for person. If you assume that everybody in the 5th century was drawing the line where I have that pen, because Chalcedon draws the line there, Chalcedon speaks of two physes, one hypostasis, one prosopon. So Chalcedon is drawing the line there. And so if you assume, therefore, that everybody was drawing the line there, then Diodor looks orthodox. And Nestorius looks orthodox. But in fact, almost nobody was drawing the line here in the 4th century or the early 5th century. When they were talking about Christ, almost everybody was drawing the line here. Which means that talk of two physes usually meant two persons and was unacceptable. Does that make sense? This is almost never talked about in Western theology books, but it's absolutely the key to understanding what's happening with the Egyptian and the Ethiopian churches in the 5th and 6th century, which is what we're going to get to today. So, when talking about the Trinity, after the Synod of Alexandria in 362, everybody is drawing the line here when talking about God. We talked about that yesterday. Okay, so hypostasis and prosopon are words for person. Ousia is the word for nature or essence. When talking about God, they're doing this. But when talking about Christ, they're usually doing this. Or if I could be a little more precise, when talking about God, they're not normally using the word physis. They're just using these other words. So I don't really even have to say they're drawing the line here. They're using these two words for person. They're using this word for essence. In the early 4th century, hypostasis was the ambiguous word. But now in the late 4th and the 5th century, physis is going to be the ambiguous word. To look ahead, the church as a whole is never going to come to agreement on how to use the word physis, like they did with the word hypostasis in the 4th century. Okay? Does this make sense? Diodor is saying, we rise up to God. If I can back up for just a minute, you have soteriology and you have philosophy. Philosophically, Greek philosophy says God cannot die. You cannot speak of God dying. You really can't even speak of God becoming physical in Greek philosophy. What do Christians do with that? Well, that depends on their soteriology. If you have a soteriology in which God does not have to come down to become human, God does not have to die because soteriology is about advancing up to God, then the philosophical concern to protect God from death can rise to the surface and you say the Logos didn't die, the Son didn't die, only the man died. See what I'm getting at? A certain soteriology, which we think is heretical, which the church says is heretical, but a certain soteriology that's out there enables you to live with the concerns of Greek philosophy. But if your soteriology says God has to come down in order to save us, not just to the point of human life, but even to the point of death on the cross, as Paul says in Philippians 2. If your soteriology demands that, then soteriology has to take precedence over philosophy. And so you have to say something like, it really was God the Son who died, but he died as man, he didn't die as God. Does everybody see the difference between those? If your soteriology says God has to come down, then you have to say, as Paul does, that the Son of God died. But you qualify that by saying he died as man. He didn't die in terms of his deity, he died in terms of his humanity. He didn't die as God, he died as man. But if your soteriology is about the upward ascent of man, then you don't have a problem. You can say the Logos didn't enter human life directly. The Logos certainly didn't die. The man Jesus did all of that. In the 4th century, Diodore is saying the second of those. The church as a whole is saying the first of those. Questions about this? Does that make sense? As you turn from the Trinity to Christology, this is the most important thing. If we can't rise up to God, the Son has to be fully God. That's a Trinitarian question. And he has to really come down himself. That's a Christological question. And Athanasius adamantly affirmed both of those, as did the whole church. Yes, you need to speak of him dying in one way while being immortal in another way. And that's complicated, which is why it's easier to say the Son doesn't die, only the man does. But you see the problems with separating them like that. To think of the man, Jesus, as being divine only in the sense of being indwelt by the Logos puts him in the same category as us. Because each of us, each believer, is a man or a woman indwelt by the Spirit. So for Christ to be a man indwelt by the Logos is not qualitatively different from that. It's basically the same. But in order to save us, Christ has to be both similar and different from us. Does that help? Okay? Think about it. If Jesus were a man in whom the Logos dwelt, Jesus couldn't say, before Abraham was, I am. He couldn't say, no one ascends into heaven except the one who came down from heaven, even the Son of Man. Because he didn't come down. He didn't exist forever. He's a man who began to exist when he was conceived in Mary's womb. But what the church as a whole is saying, and what I believe the scriptures are saying, is that he is an eternal person. He's always been the Father's Son, who is now in Mary's womb, not beginning to exist, but existing in a new way. He's not coming into existence in Mary's womb. He is beginning to exist humanly, whereas he has always existed divinely. But if we set aside the word physis for the moment, do you understand conceptually that we're talking about two different understandings of the Son that go along with two different understandings of salvation? Is that all clear? Okay, so in the 4th century, Diodore is out there. Not very well known, but he's saying what I just described. There's another person in the 4th century who is creating problems Christologically, and that person is much more famous. That is Apollinaris, or Apollinarius. Those are the same, different forms of the same name. Apollinaris was from Laodicea, not the one in Revelation, which is in Western Turkey, but the one that is near Antioch in Syria. So there are 2 Antiochs and 2 Laodiceas. There's one in Syria, and one of each in Syria, and one of each in Turkey. All right, so he is from Laodicea, that's near Antioch in Syria. And Apollinaris was a very good friend of Athanasius and was a great champion of the Nicene faith. And Apollinaris absolutely affirmed the full divinity of the Son, and he absolutely affirmed the downward movement of the Son to earth for our salvation. So he is in agreement with most of the church on the main movement. We cannot rise up to God. God has to come to us. The Son, who is fully God, comes to us through the incarnation. Athanasius and Apollinarius agreed completely on all of that. Apollinarius's problem was that he had an inadequate understanding of what it meant to be human. Apollinarius thought that if you are a spirit in a body, you are human. And so he said that the humanity of Christ consists only of his flesh, his physical body. He doesn't have a human mind or a human rational soul. Those are the same thing. Instead, the divine mind of the Logos takes the place of the human mind. Okay? And so the church argued against Apollinarius by saying that whatever Christ does not take, let me say that differently, whatever the Son does not take into his person is not saved. Gregory of Nazianzus famously said, the unassumed is unhealed. Whatever he doesn't take into his person is not saved. So if all he takes is flesh, then all that is saved is flesh. But the root of our sin problem isn't the flesh. When I sin with my hand, the problem is not that I can't control my hand and it operates on its own. My hand does what my mind tells it to. The problem is here. Fundamentally, it's not here. And so if he did not take into himself a human mind, he couldn't really be tempted. And he couldn't redeem our human minds. The unassumed is unhealed. And the church responded to Apollinarius by saying that. Now, oftentimes, people assume that Apollinarius is the main problem that the church is facing with respect to Christ in the 4th century. But what is not normally recognized, what I did not notice myself until a couple of years ago, is that in the writings where the church argues against Apollinarius, it is even more concerned about Diodor than it is about Apollinarius. If you think about it, Diodor's mistake is a bigger mistake. Apollinarianism is a heresy. But Diodor's mistake is an even bigger mistake than Apollinarius's. And so when Athanasius argues against both of them, he's more concerned about Diodor's mistake. When Gregory of Nazianzus argues against both of them in the very famous letter where he says the unassumed is unhealed, he's actually much more concerned about Diodor's mistake than he is about Apollinarius's. Why? Because Apollinarius at least gets the movement right. It's a downward movement. His mistake is a big one, but it's not catastrophic and it's not too hard to fix. His mistake is that his understanding of what it means to be human isn't sufficient. And so you need to recognize the Son takes upon himself a human mind, not just a human body. But he's got the fundamental direction of everything right. Whereas Diodor has the fundamental direction of salvation all wrong. by arguing that it's an upward ascent. In a similar way to the way Arius argued that salvation was an upward ascent, or the way the Gnostics argued that salvation was an upward ascent. Gnosticism, Arianism, and Diodorus thought, which will become Nestorianism, are not the same, but they have something very fundamental in common. So we often think of Christological mistakes as being equal but opposite. Apollinarianism on one side, Theodore, Nestorianism on this side. These are equal but opposite mistakes. And you need to come to the middle in between them. But that's not the way the church thought. The church thought the mistake of seeing salvation as an upward movement and separating the man and the logos as a much bigger mistake, a much more dangerous mistake than the mistake of failing to recognize what all is involved in becoming human. Again, I'm not saying Apollinarianism isn't a heresy. It's a serious mistake, but it's not a fundamental mistake on the order of reversing salvation. Which is why in the 4th, the 5th, the 6th centuries, there's relatively little written against Apollinarians. There's a great deal written against the idea that the man and the logos are separate persons. It is in modern theology that these are put on the same level. But in the early church, Diodorus' mistake was considered to be much worse than Apollinarius' mistake. Questions about that? Does that make sense? Solomon, is this becoming a little clearer now? Okay? Does everybody see what's going on here? Recognize that systematic theologians looking backwards like to create boxes, and they like to create symmetry. So they say things like the Council of Nicaea was focused on the oneness of God, and the Council of Constantinople was focused on the threeness of God, which is very nice and symmetric, but it doesn't have anything to do with what they were talking about in the 4th century. Or they say that you have Nestorianism over here, and you have Apollinarianism and Eutychianism over here. I'll talk about Eutyches later. Those are equal and opposite, and what Chalcedon is trying to do is not to say anything, but just to be in the middle between those two. Have you heard that kind of thing before? That's a common way for theologians to talk about it looking backwards. But that is not what was going on looking forwards. As these mistakes emerged, the mistake that would later be called Nestorianism and Apollinarianism, as they emerged, they were both recognized as being problems. But this one was a much greater problem. And I think you can see why. If you step past terminology and talk about the way they're construing salvation, upward movement versus downward descent, then I think you can see that. And also, that central sentence in the Nicene Creed looms even more important than before. Who for us men and our salvation came down. Straight out of Philippians chapter 2. That's really, really central to the church's understanding of what the Bible is teaching about what needs to happen for our salvation. Does everybody see this in the big picture? Yesterday morning, I started with the big picture of doctrinal development as a whole. This morning, this is the big picture of the relation between how you see Christ and how you understand salvation. Okay? Good. So with that in mind, are we ready to look at Athanasius' greatest student, Cyril of Alexandria? Now, Cyril was born 2 years after Athanasius died, so he was not directly a student of Athanasius. But he grew up basically in the library in Alexander because his uncle was the bishop of Alexandria. So he grew up with Athanasius' writings and everything else in the library of Alexandria, reading all of these things as he was a teenager and a young man. And so he is the greatest student of Athanasius' writings. So let's talk about Cyril of Alexandria. All right, let's have a little test here. What kind of icon is that? Greek, Coptic, Ethiopic, what kind of icon is that? Okay, yeah, this is actually a Coptic icon. The ones I showed you yesterday, I showed you a Greek one, I showed you a Coptic one, I think I showed you an Ethiopian one. No, I didn't. Just a Greek one and a Coptic one. This is a Coptic icon, even though it's written in Greek. Greek is a good guess. To say it's Greek is a good guess because the writing is Greek there. That says Saint Cyril, the Pope, and I can't read the rest of it. Sorry, I can't read the rest of it up there, but that is Greek writing. But this is a Coptic icon, an Egyptian icon of Egypt's greatest theologian. So Cyril was the nephew of Theophilus, who was the Patriarch of Alexandria at the beginning of the 5th century. As I've said, the greatest student of Athanasius' writings and also a very, very good student of the writings of Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory the theologian. So the two most important writers of the 4th century are the two most important influences on Cyril of Alexandria. He commented extensively on almost the whole Bible. The writings of Cyril that we have are about that much. For Athanasius, we have about that much. So we have about 3 times as much from Cyril as we do from Athanasius. And about 70% of it or so is biblical commentaries. In the first decade and a half that he was the Patriarch of Alexandria, he wrote a commentary on almost every book of the Bible between 412 and 425. He combated paganism, Arianism, and eventually Nestorianism. As we'll see in a minute, Nestorius showed up on the scene in the year 428. We'll talk about that year a little bit later. Up until then, Cyril was arguing against paganism and Arianism, and then after 428 against Nestorianism. He was arguably the greatest of the Eastern theologians, the greatest Greek theologian, although he wasn't actually from Greece, he was from Egypt. Cyril was ethnically Greek. Athanasius was ethnically Coptic. So it's not as bad to call Cyril a Greek theologian as it is to call Athanasius a Greek theologian. What I want to do is to talk with you about several passages. Most of these are from Cyril's commentary on John, which is his most important commentary. And I'd like to talk to you about these passages and give you an understanding of Cyril's theology. So this is the same kind of thing that I did yesterday with Athanasius. Before we actually get to the controversy, we look in a little bit of detail at the theology, the soteriology of the most important figure in the controversy. So some passages from Cyril's commentary on John about the relation between the Father and the Son. How is one who is the fruit of the Father's substance? Notice that is the language of the Creed of Nicaea, from the essence of the Father. How is one who is the fruit of the Father's substance inferior to the Father, since that substance admits no inferiority into itself? But if he is not from the Father's substance, then he is not a son, but some bastard. I don't know if you know the English word bastard. It means an illegitimate child. It's not a very polite English word, not one I recommend that you learn. But it means an illegitimate child. But some bastard, so to speak, and a son in name only. In that case, the Father would not correctly and truly be called Father either. He is called Father because of the Son. So how could he be thought of as Father if the Son is not Son by nature? Okay, notice how similar this is to Athanasius. Athanasius said it is more pious and true to name the Father from the Son, to name God from the Son and call him Father. And Athanasius is saying that, and Cyril goes even farther. He says here, the Son has to be the natural Son of the same essence or substance as the Father, the fruit of his essence, or the Father is not a true Father either. So a very strong focus on the sonship of the Son to the Father. And what I want you to notice here is that Cyril is not just talking about the equality of the persons. He's talking about the depth of the relationship between them, Father and Son. Not just he is God equal to the Father. That's true. That's crucially important. But also, he is Son to the Father, in relationship to the Father, eternally. And here a passage on the Holy Spirit. He calls the life-giving gift of the Spirit living water. This is talking about John chapter 7. Through this gift alone does human nature, though it is nearly parched to its very roots and already rendered dry and barren of all virtue by the evil work of the devil, run back up to the original beauty of its nature. It drinks in the life-giving grace and blooms with all kinds of good things. Okay, notice there are several things going on in this passage. First, of course, the Spirit is giving us living water. So the centrality of the Spirit, the importance of the Spirit shows up here. But at the same time, there's something else happening in this passage. Look at human nature runs back up to the original beauty of its nature. God created humanity, Adam and Eve, in fellowship with himself, ruling over creation in the best possible position a creature could have. We lost it through the fall. But the gift of the Spirit brings human nature back to that original beauty. Creation, fall, salvation is a restoration. Once we have fallen, once we are down here, we can't climb back up. We can't rise up to God. So the Spirit has to come down to us and bring us back to where we were at creation. Bring us back to that fellowship with God and that original beauty. So Cyril has a very strong perceptive emphasis on both the Son and the Spirit. One of the most important ideas of Athanasius that Cyril elaborates on even more is that Christ is the Son by nature. We are sons by grace. Only the one who is true Son by nature can make us sons and daughters by grace. So Cyril writes, this is on John chapter 2, where Jesus says, "Stop making my Father's house a house of merchandise." He would have said our Father's house, if indeed he knew himself to be one of those who are not sons by nature. But since the Word knows that he is from the substance of the Father and not included among those who are called sons by grace, he places himself apart from the others by calling God his own Father. When those who are called to sonship and who have this honor from the outside pray, it is fitting for them to cry, "Our Father in heaven." But since the only begotten is the only one from the one Father, he rightly calls God his own Father. Now here Cyril is talking about something that's very important in the Gospel of John. Jesus in the Gospel of John speaks of my Father and your Father, or my Father and our Father. When he says your Father, that word your is plural. In English, unfortunately, we don't have singular and plural forms for adjectives. Do you in Amharic? Okay, all right, good. So in Amharic, you recognize he's talking about you plural when he says your Father. There's a similarity between us and Christ, and there's a huge difference. There's a similarity between our relationship to God and Christ's relationship to God, and there's a huge difference. For him, God is my Father. Father in a unique way, because he is Son by nature. For us, even when only one of us is praying, we should technically say our Father, because we are children of God in an important way, but not the same way as Christ. We are children by grace. We are children by adoption. We are children in a derivative way not by nature, not eternally, as Christ is. When you read the Gospel of John, pay attention to that. My Father versus our Father or your Father. And here Cyril is picking up on that to emphasize he is the Son by nature. We are the sons and daughters by grace. Now, one of the most important things that Cyril does. In this passage, he's talking about John chapter 1. About the passage where Jesus says, "But as many as believed in him, to them he gave the authority to be called children of God. Those who were born not of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." And Cyril writes this in one of the most important passages in all of his writings. "For when he had said that authority was given to them from him who is by nature son, to become sons of God, and had hereby first introduced that which is of adoption and grace, he can afterwards add, without danger of misunderstanding, that they were begotten of God." Okay, when you say we are begotten of God or born of God, you risk a misunderstanding. You risk placing us in the same category as the Son. But Cyril is saying that there's no risk of misunderstanding here because he's already talked about the difference. The one who is Son by nature gives us authority to become children of God. We don't have that authority on our own. We receive it by grace. We receive it by adoption. So he can speak of us as being begotten because he's clearly made the distinction between being a natural son and being a son by grace and adoption. And then notice this part, that he might show the greatness of the grace which was conferred on them, gathering, as it were, into natural fellowship. Notice that phrase, natural fellowship. Those who were alien from God the Father, and raising up the slaves to the nobility of their Lord on account of his warm love towards them. Talk about that phrase, natural fellowship. 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago, when I first discovered that phrase, I spent several months trying to figure out what Cyril meant by that. And so I'll tell you what I came up with as a result of looking at the way he uses this phrase in all of his writings. The three persons of the Trinity share the same essence. They share the same nature. And on the basis of sharing that same nature, they also share fellowship. So he talks about nature, and he talks about fellowship. And occasionally he talks about natural fellowship. So when he talks about fellowship, he may be talking about family relationships or relationships between friends, relationships between human beings, etc. But when he says natural fellowship, he's talking about the fellowship between the Father, Son, and Spirit on the basis of the fact that they are the same God, on the basis of the fact that they share the same divine nature or divine essence. So he calls that natural fellowship, which makes this very, very striking. In this passage, he has already said he does not share with us the divine essence or the divine nature. I don't have it up on the screen, but he's just said that. In fact, he says, if we were to become sons by nature, he would have to expel the Son in order to make room for us to be sons. That's impossible. That can't happen. We don't ever displace him. We do not share in natural sonship. We do not share in the essence of God. We do not become additional persons of the Trinity. But the very fellowship, the very communion that the persons of the Trinity have with one another, because they share the nature, he shares that with us without giving us the divine nature. You've heard me say this week. And some of you have heard Mike Reeves say, you may have heard Josh say, and others say this as well, that the heart of salvation is our sharing in the Son's relationship to the Father, sharing in the eternal relationships that the persons of the Trinity have with one another. And I've suggested that that is the main way that some of the greatest thinkers in the early church are understanding salvation, like Athanasius. Cyril is the best of all of them in articulating this, the clearest of everybody in articulating this. And this is the passage where he most clearly explains that. So everybody see what's going on here. Without making us natural sons, without making us additional persons of the Trinity, without giving us the divine essence or the divine nature, he nevertheless gives us a share in the fellowship that directly derives from the divine nature, the fellowship the three persons of the Trinity have with one another. This is one of the most extraordinary passages in patristic literature, in my opinion. And this week I've been thinking about what books I should bring next time. And as I think about this, I'm thinking I should bring the new translation of Cyril's commentary on John. That might be one of the things that you'd like to have in your library. It's really long. It's about that thick. But it's worth it. It's worth it. Okay? Now, let's talk about something else here. Cyril is not only the best at articulating salvation as sharing in relationship. Cyril is also the best of the church fathers in articulating salvation as justification by faith. And I've written an article on this where I summarized 1,000 passages where Cyril talks about justification by faith. But let me simply give you one example here. This is based on John chapter 6, where Jesus is asked, what is the work of God? What should we do that we should do the works of God? That's chapter 6, isn't it? I think that's chapter 6. Yes, chapter 6, verses 28 and 29. And Cyril writes, the work of God is that you believe in the one whom he himself has sent. So that's exactly what Jesus says. And indeed, salvation through faith is truly superior to worship that is of the law and in types. And grace that justifies is superior to the commandment that condemns. This is an example of the kind of thing that Cyril does in many, many, many different places. Cyril, when he talks about justification, he always uses passive verbs for talking about us. We don't justify ourselves, we are justified. We are justified from the outside. He speaks often of an alien righteousness in ways that anticipate Luther. I don't know that Luther ever read what Cyril says, but this is anticipatory of what Luther is going to say. A righteousness that is granted to us from the outside. The Son is righteous in himself. We are granted righteousness from the outside. And when he uses the verb justify in active forms, the subject is always the Son or God or grace. God justifies us. We are justified. Grace justifies us. We are justified. Christ justifies us. We are justified. So one of the many great things about Cyril as a theologian is that he's the clearest expositor of justification by grace through faith in the early church. And if anybody is interested, my article where I summarize all this, there's way over 1,000 passages where he does this. And I summarize them with some statistical analysis and talk about a few of them. But anyway, the article that I do that, you can find it online in the journal Participatio, which is online. And what's the title of the article? It's called Justification by Faith in Cyril of Alexandria with some ecumenical implications, or something like that. So if anybody's interested in digging into that further, I have an article which talks about the many, many places where he does this. Salvation as sharing in the Son's relationship to the Father. Salvation as justification. Those are wedded in Cyril of Alexandria's teaching in a clearer way than you really see anywhere else in the early church. Which is part of the reason why not only I, but Mike Reeves and Union, Dan Hames, Mike Reeves, and others are so fond of Cyril of Alexandria. Okay, so this is a general overview of Cyril's Christology and his soteriology before we even get to the question of Nestorius, before he faces Nestorius at all. Anybody have any questions or thoughts about this? I saw some eyes lighting up when we got to justification. There are other people in the early church who speak well about justification by faith, but this is the clearest. Yes, Abel. That's a really good question, and that's one of the striking differences. So the three people who are going to oppose the church's consensus here are Diodor, that I just talked about, Theodore, and Nestorius is the most famous of them. So I've talked about Diodor. I'm about to talk about Theodore and Nestorius. And all three of them see salvation not only as an upward ascent of man, but they see, whenever they talk about fellowship, it is never fellowship with the Logos or fellowship with God. It is fellowship with the man Jesus, who's separate, as they understand it. So there's basically no understanding of theosis in their soteriology. It's about the upward ascent of man to a higher human condition in fellowship with what they call the assumed man, Jesus in whom the Word dwells. So that's one of the very, very striking differences. So the line between God and humanity is so sharp for those that there really can't even be any fellowship between them. So our fellowship is with the assumed man. And salvation is a perfect human state, not a state of sharing in divine life or something like that for those three. And this is another part of the reason why the church rejected them. Okay? Okay, so with all of that as background, let's talk about Theodore and Nestorius for a minute. We talked about Diodor, so now let's talk about Theodore. Theodore was from Mopsuestia, which is also in south-central Turkey today. It's very close to Tarsus. And so Diodor was in the middle of the 4th century, and Theodore was bishop at the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th century. He died in the year 428. And then Nestorius was Theodore's student. So Theodore bases all of his thought on a fundamental idea which he calls the two ages. The two ages. The first age and the second age. The first age is a state of mortality, sinfulness, and corruption. And the second age is a state of immortality, sinlessness, and incorruption. And all of Theodore's theology derives from his conviction that mankind needs to march from the first age to the second. So this is the clearest treatment of the human vocation to ascend to God that you'll ever see. The clearest that you'll ever see. First age, second age. So if the first age is one of mortality, corruption, and sinfulness, what does that have to say about the fall? And scholars disagree on this, but what seems to me to be the case is that for Theodore, there is no actual event of the fall. God created Adam and Eve mortal, sinful, and corruptible because he knew that they would sin. And so the fall sort of exists in the foreknowledge of God. It doesn't exist as an actual event. But from the moment of their creation, they were mortal and sinful and corruptible, which is very different from Athanasius, very different from Scripture, I would say, as well. So there's no actual fall. There is a fall, a so-called fall. But in effect, what that means is that God, knowing they would use their freedom badly, created them already bearing the consequences of their sin, already mortal, already corruptible, already sinful. So instead of something like creation, fall, restoration, we were created in fellowship. We fell. We can't rise up, so God has to come down to restore us. That's Athanasius. That's Cyril. That's us, I would say. That's what we think as well. But instead of that, Theodore is saying quite clearly, we are created here. We are called to rise up here. We are created mortal. We are called to rise up to immortality. We are created corruptible and sinful. We are called to rise up to sinlessness and immortality. Does everybody see how different this is? Now, in light of our general discussion of orthodoxy and theosis a couple of days ago, you may be thinking, what orthodoxy is saying sounds a lot like this. And to me, it does sound suspiciously like this. But what is very different about orthodoxy from this is that orthodoxy does affirm an actual fall. And in most cases, there are some theologians who don't, but does affirm an actual fall. And it does affirm a true descent of the Son to our condition. And then theosis follows from that. So don't think that what I described orthodoxy as saying before is necessarily guilty of Theodorianism. There are some suspicious similarities, in my opinion, but it's not the same thing as this. This is a very serious problem. Can everybody see that? Okay? So human vocation to ascend to God, grace as God's help in that ascent. And the way he describes that is the movement of humanity from the first age to the second age. If I may stop right there for a little parenthesis to try to help you with what modern theologians are saying. This idea of the ascent of man from the first age to the second age was almost identical to the major idea of Europe in the 19th century. And this may not be history that you've known or that you've learned, but in Europe in the 19th century, not in America, but in Europe, there was an enormous optimism about the perfectibility of humanity, about the upward progress of humanity. And when 19th century scholars looked at what Theodore was saying, they loved it. And they wanted it to be right. And it was problematic to them that the church had condemned this. And it was in the 19th century that Theodore and Nestorius began to be rehabilitated. And people began to say, well, they're not heretics, they're Antiochians. And the Antiochian school is a legitimate emphasis in the church. Prior to 1835, nobody had ever spoken of an Antiochian school in Christian history. It was created in the 19th century, the notion of such a school. Have you heard of the clash between Antioch and Alexandria? Different emphases, and the emphases clash, and then Chalcedon is a compromise. You've heard that, right? Okay, that began in the 19th century. And the reason it began is because the scholars were themselves Nestorians. They were Theodorians. They loved what Theodore said about the upward rise of humanity. And they didn't want it to be a heresy. And so they read the evidence in such a way that the heresy was actually representative of half the church. It was the Antiochian school. But if you want to talk about Antioch versus Alexandria, in reality, the Antiochians were 3 people. And the so-called Alexandrians were the rest of the church, including most of the people who lived in Syria, including people from Antioch itself. Well, on this side, not on the side of Theodore. So where we're headed today is going to sound rather different from what you might have heard. If you've heard Antioch, Alexandria, both acceptable, different emphases, they clash, they compromise. If that's what you've heard, what you're going to hear today is very different from that. But if it's any consolation, what you're going to hear today is much more like the way the church has told the story itself for its whole history. The story that gets into your books is a product of the last 175 years or so. Let me stop there and let you think about that for a minute. Are there questions, or would you just like to express surprise? Because this is where the story that you have probably heard differs the most from the way the church has told its own story for most of its history. What I'm trying to do is to go back to the way the church has told its own story. Okay? You see what I'm getting at? Any questions? Any objections to what I'm saying here? Between Antioch and Alexandria? Okay, in the last 175 years, people have they've taken the 3 people who were condemned, Diodor, Theodore, and Nestorius, and have added other people to that group. John Chrysostom, Severian of Gabala, John of Antioch, most importantly, Theodoret of Cyrus. They've added more people to that group, said they were the same, and called that a school. And that gives the impression that it was a well-represented school in the church. When I first started my PhD, every time I spoke of the Antiochian school, my PhD supervisor stopped me. And he said, remember, you're only talking about 3 people. And they were all condemned by the church. So the way the story began to be told in the 19th century gives you the impression, Antiochian school, that's 50% of the church. Alexandrian school, that's 50% of the church. You may have even heard the Antiochians were the good guys and the Alexandrians were the bad guys. You may have heard it said the Antiochians emphasized the real humanity of Christ. The Alexandrians didn't. That's not remotely true. But you may have heard that. So all of that gives the impression that this was a well-represented idea. This was a well-represented idea. But it also gives the impression that Christological orthodoxy is a compromise. And in my opinion, that's terrible. To think of the church's articulation of the most important aspect of the Christian faith as just a compromise between clashing emphases. I think that's terrible. I think that does great disjustice to what the church was trying to do as it listened to Scripture and talking about Christ. Does that help? Okay? Okay, so let me finish this for just a minute, and then we'll take a break. So you've got the 2 ages, the first age, the second age. We are called to ascend from the first age to the second age. Grace is God's help in that ascent, but the ascent is primarily a human task. In Protestant terms, this is work salvation. This may be the purest work salvation you get among any so-called Christians in Christian history. Christ is a graced man, a man who has received grace by the indwelling of the Logos. And therefore he has received aid in ascending to God. We are indwelt by the Spirit, graced, and follow him. He is a graced man with the grace of the Word. We are graced men and women with the grace of the Spirit. Let me mention one more thing related to this. Hebrews chapter 11. No, I'm sorry, this is the beginning of chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, let us lay aside the sin that so easily entangles us, fixing our minds on Jesus, what goes in this blank, and perfecter of our faith. Okay, the author and perfecter of our faith. Let me talk about that word for just a minute. The word that is translated author, that is correctly translated author, there is the word archegos, which basically means the first one. And a person or a being can be first in the sense of the one who authors something, the one who originates it. Or he can be first in the sense of here we are following a trail, and he's the first one in the queue. He's the one who goes first, who blazes the trail. Do you know what I mean by blazing a trail? In English, if the trail is overgrown, you take your machete and you hack away at the jungle and create the trail so people can follow more easily. That's called blazing a trail in English. So the trailblazer, the one who blazes a trail, could be thought of as the one who goes first. So the Theodore and the 19th century liberal scholars interpret this as fixing our eyes on Jesus, the trailblazer and perfecter of our faith. Now that's possible given the use of the word in regular Greek, but it's not possible in the Bible because the only other place where that word is used in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 20. Paul is talking to the Ephesian elders at Miletus, and he speaks of Jesus as the archegos of life, the author of life. It cannot mean trailblazer there. That doesn't make any sense in Acts chapter 20. And on the strength of that, it's almost certain that means author in Hebrews as well. So, Shaki, your translation is right, translating it as author. But Theodore and Nestorius are taking that as trailblazer. So instead of being the one who authors our life, who gives us life, he is simply the one who leads us first in following a trail that leads to life. Does everybody see how different this is? The differences between the church and these three people are considerably greater than the way the books often tell you. And I hope I've put enough quotes up here and given you enough explanation for you to be able to grasp that. I know this is new. I know this is different because I know what's in the theology books. But does this make sense as I talk about it? Okay? Can we entertain the possibility that this is the right way to understand what's happening? The focus is not so much on forgiveness. The death of Christ is somehow connected to forgiveness. But one of the things that Cyril says in response to Nestorius is, what good does the death of a man do if he's just a man? So that's one of Cyril's most poignant criticisms of Nestorius. So Nestorius is, in a vague kind of way, connecting forgiveness to the death of Christ. But Cyril exposes the problem with that in his way of thinking.